My name is Kevin Berger, and I am the author of Atheism is Untenable. On this channel, I don't engage in apologetics. Instead, I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. This is Justified Nonetheless. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on those notifications.
Godless Engineer states his position emphatically during an episode of The Line.
I'm not basically claiming it. I am claiming that. Okay, so there was no Jesus because our earliest reference to Jesus only pictures him as a celestial figure, and then later stories that were concocted are similar to the other mystery cults like the Isis and Osiris cult that construct earthly tales of the savior figure in order to entice people into the religion, and then once they get into the religion, they learn the mysteries of the religion. Which would be like the celestial stories of the faith. Paul uses a lot of this language that is utilized by other mystery cults. Paul only ever identifies Jesus as a celestial figure, and this actually matches up with what other mystery cults were saying at the time. And also, like, all of the major claims by Christianity, specifically what Jesus provides Christians that believe in him, are the same things that other mystery cults provide to their adherents. And those mystery cults have mythological figures at the very center of them. And so just using basic Bayesian analysis and understanding, we can come to the conclusion that Jesus is a syncretism between Mediterranean mystery cults and Judaism, because of the fact that they were expecting a Messiah figure to come and rescue the Jewish people.
So essentially, Godless Engineer's argument up to this point, expressed syllogistically, is premise 1, early Christianity shares traits with mystery cults. Conclusion, therefore, Christianity is also a mystery cult. That's an interesting inference, and I can certainly relate to the appeal to Bayesian probability. Sadly for Godless Engineer, it's still non sequitur. In addition, he's committing an analogical fallacy because the similarities between Christianity and mystery cults do not provide a direct relationship or prove the claim of syncretism. He's also cherry-picking the evidence by focusing on the similarities while ignoring unique characteristics of Christianity entirely. He's also reducing complex historical contexts and developments to a single factor, the alleged mystery cult influence. Finally, he's guilty of misapplication of Bayesian analysis due to using probabilistic reasoning without consideration of alternative explanations and excluding evidence that remains to be weighed. But he's not done yet. He goes on to say,
when that person did not come, they had to figure out a different way in order to understand their religion. And so what they did was they scoured the Old Testament in order to figure out, like, why didn't Jesus come? Or did he come? Or what information can we know about Jesus? When they did that, they came up with Patron in order to explain this archangel figure that was going to save the Jewish people. And what they discovered was that, oh, he's come, he's died, because Satan crucified him in the lower parts of the celestial realm, and then he resurrected back up into the heavens, which is similar to what Jewish philosophers were saying about other figures in Judaism, like Moses. Philo of Alexandria believed that Moses was given a divine body and descended to the earth and accomplished a whole bunch of stuff, and then when he died, he resurrected, or not resurrected, but ascended all the way back up to the upper parts of the heaven. So these are not really kind of crazy ideas about it. This all is in line with what evidence that we have. And so this explanation is supported by mountains of evidence that has been collected, since 2014.
this is all just more of the same. Non sequitur, analogical fallacy, cherry-picking fallacy, misapplication of Bayesian analysis. However, it's also noteworthy that this is where we begin to see the conspiracy theory begin to take shape. We have 1, a group of people, 2, who have concocted a plot to fabricate a fictitious person to figure out a different way in order to understand their religion by scouring the Old Testament, and 3, we have the supposed evidence in the form of these similarities between Christianity and ancient mystery cults. That's 3 of the 6 common characteristics of a conspiracy right there. When it is pointed out to him that all this can be true and it wouldn't demonstrate the claimed ahistoricity of Jesus of Nazareth, that it wouldn't show that Jesus was fabricated, whole cloth, i.e., that he is in fact committing a non sequitur, Godless Engineer goes on to say the following.
Okay, I can agree with that. But my entire spiel there, what Seth asked me to do was to explain, one, why I don't think that Jesus was a man, which entails the fact that the earliest references to Jesus are purely celestial references. Like, they only figure him to be a celestial, figure that provides these very magical solutions to Jewish problems in the first century. So that's that explanation. But then also on my shoulders is the burden of proof, explaining all of the evidence that we have in Judaism and in the first century and in Christianity. And so that was what the Patron discussion was concerning Philo and the scouring of the Old Testament in order to generate stories about Jesus, and the how Christianity is modeled off of mystery cults. So all of this is relevant to the position because you, one, have to explain the evidence that we currently have, but you also have to explain how your position could have come about given the evidence that we have.
Yep. This is still just more of the same. However, notice here the change from the initial assertion of there was no Jesus to why I don't think that Jesus was a man. He has altered the explicit assertion to an expression of skepticism. Notice too that he says, on my shoulder is the burden of proof for explaining all the evidence. That would be true if his assertion were, I have an explanation that adequately addresses all the evidence. Firstly, that isn't the claim that he made, and secondly, no, his explanation doesn't address all of the evidence. It only addresses the evidence that he has cherry-picked. Be that as it may, the burden of proof that he has incurred is for the claim that he made. That the claim is that Jesus of Nazareth is a whole cloth fabrication, and no, he has not met the burden of proof for that claim. When the concept of multiple attestation is raised, Godless Engineers...
Q didn't exist. Q doesn't exist. And that's a factual statement. Q does not exist. Like the source. So for people that don't understand, Q is a fabricated source that is supposed by some scholars out there as a way to combat the synoptic problem. And the synoptic problem is the fact that, the first three gospels that were written, they all coincide with each other. They seem to be copied off of one another in order to reconcile these things. They invented a source called the Q source, and everybody has a different idea of what's in the Q source. And the reason why everybody has a different idea about what's in the Q source is because we don't have the Q source in order to actually state what was in the Q source. So there's no way to know that Q was independent of any other Christian thought. There's also no way to know that Mark was independent of other Christian thought at the time, or that the author of Mark was truly an eyewitness or new eyewitnesses or anything like that.
So now we have a new argument expressible thusly. Premise 1, we do not have a manuscript written and attributable to author Q. Conclusion, therefore, the Q source is a fabrication. Once again, the argument is non sequitur. He seems to be guilty of a false implication fallacy here as well, as the implication is that a hypothetical document is the same thing as a fabrication. He also seems to be alluding to some sort of collusion by saying that the authors of these documents may not have been independent from other influences, and this speaks to the conspiratorial aspect of the rationale. This, of course, leads to a critical problem. The allegation, remember, is that they, whoever they are, scour the Old Testament in an attempt to reconcile it with their experience. Now, to the allegation, the argument is added that Matthew and Luke copied off one another. So to summarize, just so we are clear, 1, they scour the Old Testament in an effort to reconcile it with reality. 2, John is the seed for all of Jesus' earthly tales. Matthew and Luke copied off of him, and John at least copied off of Luke. If this is true, then how do we reconcile the fact that despite copying someone else's narrative, each of the subsequent narratives intentionally introduces new issues that have to be reconciled with another, whether one wants to call them contradictions, discrepancies, inconsistencies, or whatever. The discrepancies between the accounts of the tomb, the death of Judas, and so on, are all absolutely avoidable if they are copying off of one another. So why do they exist at all? This is saying nothing of the fact that the nativity narrative and Hitchens' assessment of it. There is no need to have a census detail and a convoluted trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem if we're talking about an entirely fictional person. that whole passage can be jettisoned without having any impact unless we are discussing a historical person and the narrative being created to cater to that person. Finally, while the writers not being eyewitnesses or access to eyewitnesses of the events can certainly provide for some doubt, it still falls short of being evidence for the alleged fabrication. It's also worth noting that while Q is debated, the consensus, even among secularists and atheists, is that Q's source is real. His view is fringe, and he is misrepresenting scholarship. And still he goes on.
Before we get to criterion of similarity and embarrassment, I want to go back to this idea of Mark being independent of Q. Well, like we already said that Q is fabricated, so there's no way to know if that truly is independent. But also, I don't think that there's any way that you can truly show that Mark is independent of anything, or that Mark got his information independently, of the Christian movement at the time. What was the source for Mark's gospel? Can you tell me who the source was?
Here again, he focuses on the independence of the text, which is a red herring fallacy, as whether or not the text is independent or not has no bearing on the existence of a historical figure. By that flawed logic, we would have to reject all of the other historical figures that are mentioned in the text. He also makes the as yet unsubstantiated assertion that Q is a fabrication. Notice, too, that he is now questioning the opposition, challenging the opposition. This is the beginning of an attempt to shift the burden of proof. He continues saying,
how does this tie us to history? How do we know, one, where this information came from, two, if this information is reliable, and three, that it wasn't found?
And here we see the burden shifting truly emerge. Godless Engineer is the one who asserted the non-existence of a historical Jesus. He has the burden of proof for that claim. It is no one else's responsibility to disprove that by showing that the text was not fabricated. Let us skip ahead.
So we don't have Mark as independent attestation. Q doesn't exist, so that doesn't work. M doesn't exist. That's another fabricated source. That doesn't work. I don't know if you've heard about that one. L, that one also doesn't exist. We've had to fabricate information that is supposedly in L. So what we have is Mark being the seed for all the other gospels that exist. That includes Matthew, Luke, and John. John definitely knew the other gospels. So all we have are Paul's epistles.
Now he is doing the same thing with the L and M sources that he did with the Q source. I am not asserting anything about the sources. He is asserting that they are fabrications. However, not having an original manuscript that can be positively identified as L, M, or Q does not, never has, and never will imply that these are fabrications. It's just bad argumentation beginning with a presumed conclusion and working backward. And yet, still, he goes on.
M and L, those things, as far as we can tell, did not exist at any point in history.
When the opposition correctly points out that this is a claim that requires evidence to support it, Godless Engineer leans fully into the burden-shifting fallacy, stating,
so you complained about me saying absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? My complaint is still the same. You're proclaiming that M and L do exist. You need to provide the evidence that they actually do exist instead of just providing claims that they do exist, which are claims that are made by scholars, admittedly, but they've had to fabricate these sources in order to solve the synoptic problem. But the fair error hypothesis, if you've ever heard of that, actually establishes that Mark is the seed gospel and that Matthew copied from Mark and then Luke copied from Matthew and Mark and then John. This is outside the fair error hypothesis, but John actually had access at least to Luke, which if he had access to Luke, then he had access to the other gospels. So it seems to be like Mark is the seed gospel for all of the earthly tales of Jesus.
L, M, or Q exist, and even if I did, it would have no bearing on his burden of proof for his own claim, though he seems to think that it does. If he asserts that there is an even number of gumballs in a jar, and I assert that there is an odd number, his inability to provide evidence for his claim does not magically absolve me of the burden of proof for mine. That's not how it works, and I am certain that he is well aware of that fact. Notice, too, that he dismisses the scholarly consensus without proper justification. Notice that he also presents the Farrer hypothesis as if it is a fact, and notice that even if we were to accept the Farrer hypothesis, this still does not imply a whole-cloth fabrication of an ahistorical figure. His argumentation involves both historical figures and modern scholarship, including secularists and atheists, mind you, developing a of a whole cloth fabrication of a non-existent person for reasons that are never really made clear. After all, what motivation would atheists have for signing on to the idea of even a historical Jesus of Nazareth? He provides alleged evidence in the form of similarities between Christianity and ancient mystery cults, while ignoring other evidence that contradicts his view. He argues that the authors of Matthew, Luke, and John copied their narratives from Mark to explain any similarities between them without addressing any of the many issues that I raise. Godless Engineer seemingly goes out of his way to tackle each of the hallmarks of conspiracy. I repeat, Jesus mythicism is a conspiracy theory. Now, to be fair, anyone who asserts that Jesus was a historical person does in fact incur a burden of proof for that assertion. And if anyone goes beyond this to assert his divinity and so on, each subsequent claim carries its own burden of proof. However, the point here is that no, there are no special rules for negative claims. Some mistakenly invoke Russell's teapot to argue that only positive claims require evidence, but this is a misapplication. The purpose is to show that the burden of proof falls to the claimant, regardless of the content of the assertion. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, and that includes the claim of a complete fabrication of a non-existent person. If the inverse analogy were presented, that there isn't a teapot orbiting between Mars and Jupiter, that would invoke a burden of proof too. If you cannot demonstrate how you know a claim is true, then you cannot demonstrate that you know it is true either, and you're merely arguing by assertion. While the Jesus mythicism argument does explain some of the available evidence, it does not explain all of the evidence, necessitating assumptions that are not properly justified. For that reason, it cannot be claimed to be as knowledge, nor can it even be appropriately described as an inference to the best explanation.